Good afternoon. Welcome to this public meeting of the Standing Committee on Government Operations. I'll start by asking committee members to introduce themselves for the record, and we'll start with Mr. Simpson.
R.J. Simpson, MLA, Haverford North.
Kevin O'Reilly, Freedom Lake.
Julie Green, Yellowknife Center.
Michael Nadley, MLA for Dutchell.
And Danny McNally, Sanctuary Region.
Shane Thompson, welcome. And Andy.
Good afternoon. Welcome to Nakamag from the Nakamag.
Good afternoon. Frederick Blake, MLA from Mackenzie Delta.
And I am Kieran Tessa, the member for Cam Lake and chair of the Standing Committee on Government Operations. And I would just like to note that we are joined in the audience today by Dr. Bob Bromley, former member for Welladay. Thank you for being here. It's always nice to see former members of our assembly. Today, the Standing Committee, and also at the table with me is Jennifer Frankie Smith, our committee clerk, and Miss April Taylor, our committee research advisor, and Sheila McPherson, law clerk of the Legislative Assembly. Today, the Standing Committee on Government Operations is holding a public clause-by-clause review of Bill 42, an act to amend the Petroleum Products Tax Act, and Bill 43, an act to amend the Income Tax Act. Bill 42 amends the Petroleum Products Tax Act to impose a carbon tax on petroleum products and natural gas, clarify that all existing provisions in the act related to the current fuel tax are noted as such, provide an exemption from the fuel tax for petroleum products delivered to or purchased by an Indian or Indian band or on a reserve, or used by a designated municipal authority that is recognized by the minister as representing a community, make the necessary amendments for collection and administration of this tax in the same manner as the current fuel tax, which requires purchasers to pay the tax and vendors and collectors to remit the tax to the GNWT, allow the minister to provide in regulations for rebates and grants, increase the maximum fines and penalties which may be imposed as administrative penalties on summary conviction, and set out a process for the appeal of an assessment of tax, interest, or administrative penalties under the Act. Bill 43 amends the Income Tax Act to provide a cost of living offset as a mechanism for returning carbon tax revenues to Northwest Territories residents. Bill 43 also amends the Income Tax Act to make changes in non-refundable tax credits claimed by multi-jurisdictional tax filers, including changes that restrict the Northwest Territories pension credit to NWT residents, and changes that allow full pension and dividend credits to be claimed by NWT residents with business income earned outside of the Northwest Territories. This amendment, which is not related to the implementation of carbon tax, arises out of a discussion between the Department of Finance and the Canadian Revenue Agency, aimed at harmonizing the provincial territorial tax treatment of pension and dividend tax credits for multi-jurisdictional tax filers. It will have the effect of denying NWT pension credits to non-residents with business income earned in the NWT and allowing full pension and dividend tax credits to NWT residents with business income earned outside the NWT. Bills 42 and 43 received second reading in the Legislative Assembly on March 8, 2019, and were referred to the Standing Committee on Government Operations for review. For committee, the review of these bills has been a frustrating one in comparison with most other bills. There are a number of reasons for this. First, while the Department of Finance began to engage with committee on this initiative more than 2 years ago, in June of 2017, it was not made clear to committee that the information being shared was for information purposes only, and that the input of regular members was not being sought. Committee wrote several letters to the minister raising committee's concerns with the proposed approach. In retrospect, committee does not feel that its input was given due consideration. For example, according to Finance's own public information, the federal government has already approved the GNWT's approach in September 2018, while committee was still in the process of reviewing the legislative proposal for this initiative. Committee has found it difficult to sift through this material to come to a clear determination on the salient differences between the federal backstop and the GNWT's own approach. To put it bluntly, committee has not had an easy time getting a straight answer to its questions. In this regard, the federal government has not been very helpful either. In response to very specific questions posed to the Federal Minister of Environment and Climate Change Canada, committee was directed to public information on the Government of Canada's website that was not specific to the Northwest Territories. The third problem committee has encountered is that the majority of the information provided to the committee, for the committee's consideration, has been shared by the minister in confidence, thereby preventing the committee from using this information to have an informed dialogue with the public about the carbon tax proposal. This is particularly vexing with respect to Bills 42 and 43, where the majority of the GNWT's proposal is not contained within the legislation itself, but in regulations and other public policy instruments. Committee originally planned to hold public meetings in Fort Providence, Hay River, Inuvik, and Yellowknife. However, on May 8th of this year, committee was notified in writing by the finance minister that the GNWT had revised its carbon tax approach for large emitters, those emitting 50 kilotons or greater of annual greenhouse gas emissions. When this news was not shared with the public during the spring sitting of the Legislative Assembly, committee subsequently issued a news release on June 7th, 2019, outlining committee's decision to postpone these public consultations until more information was provided by the Department of Finance. Committee wishes to take this opportunity to thank the Minister for responding positively to the committee's request by preparing plain language summaries of both bills that could be shared with the public. Copies of these documents are available at the back of the room. Unfortunately, the minister's response to the committee's specific questions was also marked confidential, rendering the committee unable to explain to the public how the GNWT's approach to large emitters has changed. A second news release was sent out on July 15th, noting that the committee was still not comfortable that it had a full picture of the impacts of the GNWT's proposed approach on NWT residents, as compared with the federal backstop, sufficient to enable committee to adequately answer questions from the public on these finance-sponsored bills. Instead, committee opted to hold a single public meeting in Yellowknife on August 1st, while also requesting written submissions with a deadline of midnight on August 1st. Committee thanks every individual and organization who attended this meeting in order to share their views and for the written submissions received. Committee will not be proposing any amendments to Bill 42 and 43. The details of the submissions received by committee and the nature of committee's deliberations will be addressed in our report to be presented in the Legislative Assembly next week. There are copies of the bill available at the back of the room. I will now invite the Honourable Minister of Finance to introduce himself and his staff for the record and proceed with any opening comments that he may have. Mr. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon, committee. I'm here to present Bill 42 and 43. With me today is the Deputy Minister of Finance, Mr. David Stewart, the Deputy Secretary to the Financial Management Board, Mr. Jamie Cooey, Director of Fiscal Policy, Ms. Kelly Bluck, and Legislative Counsel, Ms. Sherry J. Rock, and my Ministerial Special Advisor, Mr. Robert Collinson. These critical pieces of legislation will allow the GNWT to meet its carbon pricing commitment under the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change through a carbon tax on all petroleum and natural gas fuels except aviation fuel. The purpose of Bill 42 is to amend the Petroleum Products Act to create a carbon tax on petroleum products and natural gas so that the collection and administration of the carbon tax is the same as the current fuel tax. The purpose of Bill 43 is to amend the Income Tax Act to partly offset the impact of the carbon tax by providing residents a cost of living offset benefit. Bill 43 also includes some administrative changes to non-refundable tax credit claimed by multi-jurisdictional individual tax filers to align with other jurisdictions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Are there any general comments from committee at this point? Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So, as I understand it in the bill, there's not going to be any separate accounting done or reporting related to the collection and expenditure of the carbon tax. Is that correct? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Mr. Minister.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I think one of the commitments that we did make was that we were going to table an annual report in the Legislative Assembly.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Okay, well, that's great, because that commitment is not contained in the bill itself. Can the minister provide us any details about what this annual report is going to contain? Because this is brand-new news to me. Thank you.
Mr. Stewart?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So I think what we had talked about at one of our committee meetings was reporting on both the revenues that were collected under the various types of fuel and then the various rebates and those sorts of things. I think we'd also want to report on the energy initiatives that are proposed with some of the revenues as to what those revenues are going towards as well. But we'll frame up the exact content of the annual report and certainly could consult with members in terms of anything else that they might want to see in that annual report. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Can someone explain to me then why there's no provision in the bill itself to do this annual reporting? It's something that I personally recommended on the floor of the House in committee meetings, and there's nothing in the bill about public reporting. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Mr. Stewart?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. There was some discussion, I know, with committee around whether it would be appropriate to report that through the public accounts process, whether we should include it as part of the annual budgeting or business planning process. We landed on a separate report being tabled annually. And I think that was the commitment that was made at standing committee. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Trying to choose my words carefully here. I'd like to just confirm with the law clerk, if I may, that committee is not in a position to amend the bill with regard to including a provision for annual reporting of revenues in, revenues out, use of the revenues, that sort of thing. Can I do that, Mr. Chair?
Yes, Mr. O'Reilly, I'll allow it. Madam Clerk?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That motion would likely be out of scope because the bill is fairly narrowly drafted and as currently written doesn't include anything that would allow us to tag on an annual report. That determination would need to be, the determination as to scope is both a legal issue and it is also a procedural issue that we would make in consultation with Madame Clerk. But in discussing the matter with her, it would be my advice that based on the current clauses, that that an amendment to add in a public annual report requirement would be out of scope, given that there's no section that we can tag it on to.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, certainly in my remarks at second reading on the bill, I recommended in my discussions in committee meetings, and it's my understanding the committee raised this itself, that there should be some sort of annual reporting, and I think it should be in the bill itself, that requires reporting of the revenues that are collected under the carbon tax and the expenditures that are made of that money, the effect of the impact of that spending in terms of greenhouse gas reductions, what it's invested in, how it's going to allow us to meet the Pan-Canadian Framework target. I can't express my disappointment strongly enough about the fact that that is not contained in the bill. We don't seem to be in a position to require that, so we will have to rely on the commitment made by this minister, and I don't think that that's sufficient, Mr. Chair, but I'll leave that at that. If the minister wants to make any comments about it, that's great, but I do have other lines of inquiry that I'd like to pursue, but I'll leave it at that for now. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. You still have time on the clock, but Minister, if you'd like to respond to Mr. O'Reilly, you may continue. Mr. O'Reilly, you can continue with any other questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'd like to know, as I understand it, in Bill 42, the grants and rebates, the rebates that are going to be provided at point of sale for, say, heating oil and so on, grants that are going to be made to large emitters, all of that is going to be done through regulation. What can someone describe to me the process that's going to be used to set those rates, and what involvement the standing committee or indeed the public will have in providing input into what those rates of investment and so on should be. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Stewart?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So there's a couple of areas there in terms of the heating, fuel, and propane rebate. That was planned to be 100% rebate on the carbon tax collected on those two fuels. Similarly, on the for electricity producers for community electricity, they're rebating their carbon tax. The cost of living offsets are set in regulation. We've described those rates or the levels in terms of for individuals 18 and over as well as children. And then there will be the description of for the large emitters, how much will be rebated as a percentage, which was described, as well as the trust accounts in terms of what will go into those individualized trust accounts. But those will be done with regulation after the bill is passed. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So what provision is there for public input and indeed standing committee or regular MLA input into the development of those regulations? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Minister?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I believe we've described our approach, everything that we were going to do. As far as the regulations go, and I can't make a commitment for the future minister, but I'm sure with the department being here that they would recommend to the future minister that they engage with standing committee and seek some input from them as they're developing regulations. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Mr. O'Reilly?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Well, yeah, and I appreciate the minister can't bind the next minister on this. And of course, there's nothing, though, in the bill itself that requires any kind of public engagement, involvement, or even regular MLA engagement or involvement in the development of these regulations. And why this is critically important is those will determine the amount of revenues that our government gets to keep and reinvest, and what's given back and so on. Those are key policy decisions that will be made by a future Minister of Finance without necessarily any public engagement or involvement. So I'm quite concerned about that, Mr. Chair, and I had hoped that there would be more detail in the bill itself around opportunities for public engagement, involvement, and even involvement of regular MLAs in setting what these rates would be, but that doesn't appear to be the case. I understand the minister can't make a commitment on future minister, but this is not a good situation to be in, Mr. Chair. I don't know whether anybody has any comments about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Mr. Minister?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, as I said earlier, that I can't make that commitment on their behalf, but what I can commit to, the department's here, and more likely will all be here at the beginning of the 19th Assembly as they're having their briefings and discussions with the future minister. Then they would make some recommendations based on some of the input that they've heard today. So that will happen, and I'm sure they will brief them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Mr. O'Reilly, you've got a minute left.
Yes, Mr. Chair, thank you. I guess what I would say is that without a clear commitment on some type of public reporting and greater accountability on the collection of the funds, what they're going to be spent on, how that impacts greenhouse gas reductions, how the money is actually invested into energy projects and so on. Without some sort of comprehensive reporting about that, I just not clear on how we can hope to achieve our Pan-Canadian framework targets. And without a role for the public and regular MLAs in setting what the rebate rates and the grant rates are going to be, I just not sure how this is going to work out, and I will find it very difficult to support this bill. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Any comment, Mr. Minister?
Mr. Chair, the members' comments are noted, and everybody has their opinions on this particular bill. To me, it's actually very simple. There's some work that needs to be done. We have the capacity over at the Finance Department to do all the work that needs to be done, do the reporting that's required to be reported. And I've been sitting in this chair for about 11 years, and I know in those 11 years I've met with committee numerous times on different pieces of work that the government's doing, seeking committee's input. So there is some input there, and there'll continue to be some in the future. But all this is this was a Southern decision. We all know that. And what we're trying to do is come up with a Northern solution for a Southern decision. And we're trying to mitigate the impact that is going to have on residents, businesses, communities in the Northwest Territories. And I believe through the work that our folks have done that we've achieved most of that. But it's a lot more palatable to the people of the Northwest Territories that we use an approach that was made in the Northwest Territories instead of using the federal backstop, which I believe would be more burdensome on the residents of the Northwest Territories. And it's not something that I would want to go out there and say that I prefer a federal backstop, even though it's going to cost citizens of the Northwest Territories more. And there's still work to be done. Our folks are doing the work, will continue to do the work. As with most things we work on, there will be some reporting, what that consists of. I'm not quite sure at this moment, but there'll be some reporting, obviously, and there'll be opportunities for the future Assembly, the 19th Assembly, to get regular updates from the Finance Department as to how this is all rolling out. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Mr. McNeely, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for your recent comments again here compared to the last time. They're highlighting and minimizing the cost impacts with our design in the North carbon bill. And as I mentioned last year, educating the people on the impacts. Take the trapper and hunter downtown Cove Lake. He or she is going to see an increase at the pumps. And it seems that's all they see. But the tax credits, if you can make it weekly payments, it'll be good. And I haven't had any discussions with the aviation community. I'm thinking if your department has had any communication with the aviation industry, take the sole provider of scheduled service in the SA2. So Northright is going to be exempt for aviation fuel, but not their building. When they put this diesel fuel in their building to heat the building, there's going to be a cost to the commercial rate of that product. In that case, rising the operating cost, the administration side of the business. Is there any information from that your department has received from the aviation community saying, based on that, we have to increase our rates? Has your department have had some communication with the aviation community? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, we were able to negotiate with Canada's exemption of aviation fuel, recognizing that one of the main transportation in the Northwest Territories is flying, so we were able to get an aviation fuel exemption, and as well as heating their buildings. I mean, the businesses will get a rebate, I believe, at the point of purchase, so there would really be no extra cost to them because they'd get rebated right at the point of purchase, and so they won't have to worry about passing those costs on to onto the consumer. We tried very hard in our negotiations with Canada to try, and again, I'll say it, and I said it to Mr. O'Reilly, is to mitigate the impact that it was going to have on residents in the rest of the territories, and we were able to negotiate a couple things with Canada that I believe allows us to do that. Heating fuel is a huge one. Heating fuel is a huge one. As we know, heating fuel in this climate, especially further north, a lot more people depend on heating fuel to heat their buildings. Community government depend on heating fuel to heat their infrastructure, and so that was a huge one, and that we were able to get that, and so I think that mitigates some of the impact. We do see some. I've noticed it back where I'm from, where there's a lot more people out getting hauling wood and installing wood stoves and cutting their fuel consumption down by quite a bit. So the aviation fuel and the heating fuel are both two costs that the aviation industry would not have to be too concerned about.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Thank you, Mr. McNeely. Anything further from committee members? I just wanted to add a few comments of my own. I spoke to the committee's process around this, but a key consideration for this committee was to evaluate the two different approaches that are available to this assembly to consider, one being the federal approach, the other being the GNWT's approach. And as I indicated, getting clear information to those differences was quite difficult, which is why the committee feels strongly that we were unable to undertake the kind of discussions with Northerners that are important to move this forward. I don't think the committee is confident that the picture is as clear, that one approach is superior to the other, because we quite simply have not had the evidence before us to consider that. The committee previously recommended different rates and structures for how the granting programs would work. And also recommended a 4-year tax plan, as this is the imposition of a new tax, which is one of the core powers of any public government in Canada. Tax needs to be carefully considered by a legislative assembly, and I think members wanted to see a more direct role in adjusting the tax, adjusting the granting formula, those kind of things. And again, we're not left with those options. Those options weren't presented to us for recommendation or changing. And finally, the committee notes that the public engagement materials that have been prepared by the department greatly promote the mitigation to cost of living without clearly laying out the costs of how Northerners are going to see their cost of living increase with the coming tax. And you see that in other carbon pricing public material in provincial governments, that they do clearly lay out what the costs are going to be and any kind of credits or offsets that their provincial governments are providing. So those are still why we're in this, why we took the position we did. And it's not to say that we did not carefully consider what was presented for us, but we simply lacked the evidence to make an informed decision on which approach was superior. So I did want to clarify that position. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you. I'm looking at some of the finance material online, and I'm not sure when this was put up, but it is comparing the federal backstop with the NWT approach, the direct and indirect costs, and it shows that the GNWT expects households to be given to get more in rebates than they paid out in carbon tax. So it'll be it said there will be a net positive impact on households in the range of $400 approximately. And if you look at the large emitters, they're receiving 75% of the non-motive and heating fuel back as a grant or a rebate, and then the other 25% is going to be put into an individualized trust. So large emitters like the mines are looked after, and families are looked after, but again, there's nothing for small business in here, and I've been bringing this up since we began talking about this, and I know the answer is always that, we'll just pass, small businesses will pass the costs on to consumers. But I don't understand why consumers are coming out ahead in the GNWT's plan, and there's no consideration given to small businesses. There seems to be extra money that's going back to consumers. And that money is ultimately coming from small businesses, I guess, because everyone else is accommodated here. And I know the feds, and I don't know if this is related, but they've reduced their tax on small business because they know that there's going to be an increase, and there are about 6 or 7% of the federal plan or the federal money collected will be going to small and medium-sized businesses. So other than the basically instant rebate on heating fuel and or I guess on heating fuel, what does the GNWT plan to do for small businesses to help offset this cost? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Mr. Minister.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, first of all, we shared as much information as we possibly. We met with committee numerous times. We've told committee about the difference between the federal and the Canadian backstop, or the federal backstop, and our Made in the North approach to mitigating the impact on residents in Northwest Territories. So I believe that we've tried to keep committee as much in the loop as possible and listen to a lot of suggestions that committee has. And to Mr. Simpson's point, there are some, the heating fuel is a big one, because that's one of the major cost drivers for a lot of small businesses. The exemption on aviation fuel is another one, because a lot of their goods have to fly around. Electricity rates will not increase as a result of the carbon tax, because the carbon tax paid on fuel to produce community electricity will be rebated. So I believe there is some approach in there to help the small business, because we know they are the backbone of the Northwest Territories, and what we can do to help them mitigate their costs so that they won't have to pass as much of the costs on to the consumer had we used a federal backstop, which would have, I think, added huge cost to operation in Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you. And just to clarify what was just said, the Minister stated that electricity rates will not increase because of the carbon tax, because of the exemption for fuel used to generate, or diesel used to generate electricity. But the chances are that this tax, which applies to everything else, will cause an increase in all sorts of rates, in municipal tax rates, in the rates to generate power, because NTPC and NUL, they have vehicles. They consume goods that are subject to this carbon tax as well. So I just want to clarify that this will have an effect on everything. It's not like anything other than the heating and the aviation fuel will go up. So I just want to point that out. And I will say this: I do appreciate the exemption for heating fuel. I know that in the middle of winter the prices go up, and I think that that was an excellent get by the GNWT. If we could have got that for automotive fuel, I think it would have been even better. So I'll just leave it at that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Next, Ms. Green, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to seek clarification on the minister's assurance that there won't be an impact on small businesses. Small businesses that ship items into the NWT for sale are already paying the Alberta carbon tax, which has increased the cost of doing business. So when they start to pay the NWT carbon tax, there will be an increase in the cost of products that are shipped here and sold to consumers. So consumers will see the difference. That I don't see how it can be otherwise based on the experience I have with the business that we run. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Minister.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't believe I said that there will be no increase in cost to small business. I think as a member for Hay River North, as a member for Hay River North pointed out, there's going to be an impact pretty well on everything. And what I said was we are trying to do what we can to mitigate the impact that it's going to have on businesses, communities, and people of the Northwest Territories. So let's just make that very clear.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Ms. Green.
Yeah, I don't know how you're going to make that specific. So, in the case, let's say building materials that are shipped up here by Home Hardware for resale to consumers, how are you going to mitigate the cost of the carbon tax on that shipment? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Mr. Minister.
Well, we believe that our cost of living offset will help mitigate some of the impact on the people in Northwest Territories, and we understand that with some of the other jurisdictions. We get a lot of our goods in from other jurisdictions, so they're going to have a cost to them, especially if they're using the federal backstop, which would add a lot more cost onto the people of the Northwest Territories had we chosen to go that route. So there will be some cost. I mean, we can't get away from that. It's going to happen. But what we're trying to do through the cost of living offset and some of the initiatives we have is to, again, offset that and try and mitigate the impact as much as possible.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Ms. Green?
Thank you for your response. Is there any evidence that shows that based on the amount of spending and the kind of spending that people in the Northwest Territories do, what the costs will be to them of the carbon tax? Thank you.
Mr. Stewart?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. In the report we released at the start of this a couple of years back on the engagement report, we did lay out some of those household impacts that were estimated. The federal government also did some work in that area, looking at the various impacts of the carbon tax as it was implemented, and obviously at that point they didn't know the offsets, but there is detail in terms of the types of impacts on various components of expenditure. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Ms. Green?
Thank you for that response. Is that information up to date given the changes that have occurred in the 2 years since? Thank you.
Mr. Stewart?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yes, it would be up to date in the sense that obviously it was still $50 a ton that was proposed back when we first started this work, so I don't think there'd be any sort of appreciable difference. Is it possible, I suppose, that the composition of household expenditure changes on an annual basis? Sure, but it changes for every type of household as well, but I don't think it'd be an appreciable difference in terms of the impacts. Thank you.
Mr. Stewart. Ms. Green?
Thank you. Are there any follow-up studies planned to see what the actual impact is? Thank you.
Mr. Stewart?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Mr. Chair. So I think we will be certainly monitoring things like the consumer price index and those sorts of things to see where the types of, certainly on the consumer expenditure side. And then obviously we'll be tracking in terms of how much fuel being used and how much tax we're collecting as part of the overall monitoring of both greenhouse gas emissions and the implementation of carbon tax. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Ms. Green?
Nothing further. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Anything further from committee? Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I had a few specific questions here. We had a presentation from the Northwest Territories Association of Communities, and they expressed some concern over the lack of municipal rebates, and just wondering how are municipal governments going to be treated under the carbon pricing system? Will they be eligible for any rebates? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Mr. Minister?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I think we've tried to address that through the rebate on the heating fuel, because that is one of the major cost drivers in the communities, as well as the cost of electricity. So as far as an actual rebate go, that not being contemplated at this point. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, we received that concern and issue, and committee may decide to make recommendations around that. But the rebates that are going to be offered to individuals and families, really, the way of doing that is through people have to file a tax return. And can someone tell me what the, percentage of tax filers is in the Northwest Territories? Just a rough, the people that are eligible to file tax returns, how many of them actually file returns? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly.
It varies by community.
Mr. Minister?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. It's 97% that have filed. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Mr. O'Reilly?
Great, I didn't realize that we were all so eager to get tax returns, but does that vary across communities or regions? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Mr. Stewart?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. We've actually done some work with CRA on that, and it doesn't seem to vary a lot in that a lot of the programs and benefit programs, whether it's the child benefit or old age security, require you to file an income tax return. So it's hard to get really accurate population estimates when you get down to the very smallest communities by age, but I think in general, it appears to be very consistent across the various types of communities and sizes of communities. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. What kind of communications plan is there? Is there one in place? Is there one ready to go in terms of implementing this? I note that, of course, we have a rather interesting advertising campaign going on in local newspapers, but is there anything in terms of information that's going to be made available to members of the public to explain how this is going to roll out? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Minister?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll comment first, and then I'll turn it over to Mr. Stewart to talk about the communication. But, yeah, we did have some ads that were put in the paper because I think there was a misunderstanding out there that using the federal backstop, I'm not sure if members of the public were too aware of that, and that could be a fault of ours, that using the federal backstop would actually cost residents in the Northwest Territories a lot more than using our Made in the NWT approach. I think many of them believe that if carbon tax was killed in the Northwest Territories, that was the end of carbon tax. And what we're saying is that carbon tax is going to be implemented regardless because it's a federal government initiative. And though we were challenged with trying to find a solution that would help, and I use the word mitigate too many times, but that's exactly what we were trying to do, the impact of people in the Northwest Territories. So what I wanted them to know, we wanted them to know this carbon tax was going to be implemented regardless. And so using the federal backstop would cost them a lot more. We put some information, I think, with some comparisons on our website. So people could see that if they choose to look it up. But we needed to get the message out there that this was coming, whether we wanted it to or not, and we're just doing what we can to mitigate the impact on residents in Northwest Territories, and I think we've partially accomplished that. And I'll go to Mr. Stewart, if you may, Mr. Chair, to talk about the communication.
Mr. Stewart?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So we do have a communications plan in place on this, and there'll be a couple of pieces to that. The CRA will be doing some communications for us to let people know what's coming. In terms of the cost of living offset, we have some more general communications, and we've also been working with our fuel distributors, so they are ready to go upon time that it needs to be implemented in terms of both the implementation of the carbon tax and then the offset for the heating fuel. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Could that plan be shared with committee? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Minister?
Yes, it can,
Thank
Mr.
you,
Chair.
Mr. Minister. Mr. O'Reilly?
Yeah, thanks. I'm not going to drag this out anymore. I'm going to save my political take on the advertising that was undertaken without any notice to regular MLAs. I'll leave that to the floor of the House, but I'm equally concerned about mitigating the impacts of climate change on our residents. But I'm going to leave the rest of the political debate and discussion around whether this is the right plan or not for the Northwest Territories, and whether it might be sent back for further consideration. I'll leave that to the floor of the House. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Mr. Minister, I'll give you the last word.
No, that's fine. I'm cool.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Committee, does committee agree to conduct a clause-by-clause review of Bill 42, an act to amend the Petroleum Products Tax Act? Thank you, committee. We will defer the title of the bill until the end and begin with consideration of the clauses. There are 22 clauses and one schedule in the bill. We will consider the clauses in groups. Please turn to page 1 of the bill. Clauses 1 through 5. Clauses 6 through 10. Clauses 11 through 15. Clauses 16 through 20. Clause 21. Clause 22. To the schedule. Thank you, committee. We will now return to the bill number and title. Bill 42, an act to amend the Petroleum Products Tax Act. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. Does the committee agree that Bill 42, an act to amend the Petroleum Products Tax Act, is now ready for consideration in committee of the whole? Mr. Simpson.
I move that Bill 42, an act to amend the Petroleum Products Tax Act, be reported to the Assembly as ready for consideration in committee of the whole.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. There's a motion on the floor. The motion's in order. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? Any opposed? Motion carried. Bill 42, an act to amend the Petroleum Tax Act, will be reported to the Assembly as ready for consideration in committee of the whole. Does committee now agree to conduct a clause-by-clause review of Bill 43, an act to amend the Income Tax Act? Thank you, committee. We will defer the title of the bill until the end and begin with consideration of the clauses. There are 5 clauses in the bill. Please turn to page 1. To clause 1. To clause 2. To clause 3. To clause 4. To clause 5. We will now return to bill number and title, Bill 43, an act to amend the Income Tax Act. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. Does the committee agree that Bill 43, an act to amend the Income Tax Act, is now ready for consideration in committee of the whole? Mr. Simpson.
I move that Bill 43, an act to amend the Income Tax Act, be reported to the Assembly as ready for consideration in committee of the whole. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Motion's in order. The motion's on the floor. To the motion.
Question.
Question has been called. All those in favor? Any opposed? Motion carried. Bill 43, an act to amend the Income Tax Act, will be reported to the Assembly as ready for consideration in committee of the whole. Before we adjourn, I just wanted to point out a procedural issue. Obviously, some members talked about bringing things to the floor earlier, and how our process works is the final determination of these bills occurs after this stage of the committee, and that's where all members have an opportunity to vote on each clause of the bill, to address each clause of the bill, and to propose amendments, et cetera. At this stage, all amendments and changes to the bill are can be moved by committee, but the sponsoring minister needs to agree, and in this case, no changes were sought. So there will be further debate on this item of legislation in the House proper starting next week, and there'll most likely be more spirited debate and commentary on how this plan works for the Northwest Territories. So with that, I will thank the minister and your officials for appearing today, and thanks to all members of the public, members of the committee, and other MLAs who joined us today for joining us in this important discussion. Mr. Minister, do you have any closing comments?
Well, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate committee's time, and I think this is kind of important to people in the Northwest Territories that this government's shown some leadership, and when I say this government, I talk about the Legislative Assembly, in trying to address a decision that wasn't made by us, and that we're doing what we can to mitigate the impact, and I think it's a message that we need to send to the residents in the Northwest Territory that this Assembly is working on their behalf to try and mitigate any kind of impact that federal decisions are made on them. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Thank you all. We are adjourned.